Plans for the gardens are always changing and transforming, just like they do in other areas of our lives. Sometimes this change can be prompted by new information or a better idea or a change in context. But sometimes enough issues develop and compound each other so that it makes more sense to do something completely different than to stick with some variation of our original plans. I had a fairly radical version of this happen to me with my plans for one of my polytunnels this summer. I put up this polytunnel in the black plot early last summer. I had dug the soil fairly roughly, laid down some ground cover fabric through which I planted a lot of tomatoes and other heat-loving crops. It was all a little bit late going in and I had some issues with the plants, but I got a reasonable yield for my efforts. I didn't grow anything in this polytunnel over the winter and kept the soil covered to help deal with some of the persistent weed issues. Then early in the spring, I dug over all the beds, added some chicken manure pellets to help increase the fertility, and then planted a range of cool season crops that would be harvested before the main summer crops would go in. I had plans to fill the polytunnel with cucumbers, tomatoes, French beans, and other heat-loving crops that would be harvested in the summer and right through the autumn, but now that's not going to happen due to a number of different issues. It was a very long and cold winter and a very late spring, which delayed a lot of things in the garden and really slowed the growth in the polytunnel. And then suddenly everything was really busy when it finally did warm up, and it seemed that a lot of work was needed to be done in the other gardens at the same period of time that I needed to start to work to transition this polytunnel from spring crops to summer crops. This was compounded by the fact that I mistimed the sowing of some of the early season crops, which meant that the beds weren't ready when the warm season crops were ready to be transplanted, which left these plants a little bit stressed, or at least needing more attention than I was able to give them. With all of the other work going on, I was delayed sowing some of the cucumbers and other crops I wanted to put into this polytunnel, and it seems that a healthy population of slugs has developed with the early spring crops. Another big issue is I just don't have enough compost for this growing space. All of my available compost is being used up in the family scale gardens, especially in the no-dig garden. I'm making a lot more for next year, and I did get a load of lovely farmyard manure from my organic farming friends, but that's not going to be mature until next year. I have been able to add some concentrated fertility and other soil amendments, but the lack of good compost has probably contributed to some of the issues that I had with some of the crops last season and this spring. The early crop of beetroot seemed quite stunted, and the onions got downy mildew, and a lot of the greens seemed discolored and showing signs of deficiencies quite quickly. All of these crops did much better in my other polytunnel, which has much more developed soil and fertility. The soil sample that I recently got tested showed signs of significant deficiencies in some of the key nutrients, especially potassium, sulfur, boron, and zinc. And the imbalance of fertility is going to take some work to fix. And to top it all off, it seems that a lot of the tomato plants that I've transplanted into this polytunnel have been infected by cucumber mosaic virus, while plants from the same batch that I transplanted into my other polytunnel seem perfectly healthy. If I look at each of these issues independently, there are solutions. For example, the stressed plants will usually recover if given enough care and attention. Careful liquid and foliar feeding could help to manage some of the soil deficiencies, and I could always side dress with amendments and available compost while the plants are growing, but this isn't ideal, especially with the landscape fabric in place. The infected tomato plants can be removed and destroyed, and I can carry on with the other crops, and any late plantings will still produce even if the yield is reduced. And there's always ways of managing the slug population. By carrying on and continuing with my plans, I would still get a yield out of this polytunnel through the summer and autumn, even if the quality and quantity was less than I would want. Taken together, all of these issues just seem excessive. I've taken on too much for the context and the weather that we've had, and for personal and family reasons, I've decided not to get any woofers or other volunteers to help me this season. But more importantly, things just don't seem healthy in this polytunnel. Thinking about all of this, I realized that continuing with some variation of my original plans made less sense than doing something completely different. So, my radical new plan is to pull out all of the plants to completely clear the tunnel. Then I'll let my flock of hens in to help deal with the slugs while I dig to remove any remaining weeds. Then I'll add all the amendments that I need to remineralize the soil and water it in well. Then I will sow a green manure or cover crop over the entire space, probably a mix of fast-growing, heat-tolerant plants with a focus on building soil structure and producing lots of tender organic matter. All of this fresh organic matter can be dug into the soil later in the summer, and then the entire polytunnel can be planted with cooler season crops. This will provide a range of vegetables to be harvested through the autumn and into the winter. This was a tough decision to make, as I'd really prefer to harvest an abundance of summer crops. Thankfully, I've got another polytunnel which will grow enough to supply most of our own needs, but unfortunately my neighbors are going to miss out. This means that there won't be as much income to be able to invest back into developing the gardens, and I won't be able to fill my freezer and cellar with the abundance of summer. But I think this change of plans is a good second choice, to build the soil and to set things up better for the future rather than struggling on. I will get lots of autumn and winter crops that I otherwise wouldn't have, and I will be better able to maintain production from this polytunnel through the winter and into next spring. This change of plans immediately lightened the workload for me, which was a relief, and it takes some of the pressure off over the next few months, which will allow me to spend more time in the other gardens and to develop other areas of the black plot. Overall, I think that all of my gardens will now be significantly better off next year than if I'd continued with my original plans. Well, that's the hope anyways. Getting the most out of a polytunnel in this climate can be a tricky balance. Attempts to maximize the amount of summer crops you get means that you're less likely to get as many spring crops or even winter crops out of the same polytunnel. I plan to make a video about this issue of succession cropping fairly soon, as well as a video about my change of plans for this polytunnel in this summer. I also have lots of other ideas for videos that I plan to make in the near future. If you appreciate my work, please like, share, and subscribe, as the more people who do that, the more successful this YouTube channel will be. And the more people who can support me financially through my Patreon page linked here or in the description below, the more successful this Red Gardens project will be and the easier my life will be. But most importantly, thank you for watching.